Hi, Miss Hoyman. Interesting.
Good
You're not
morning.
actually on the record. Good morning.
How are you this morning?
Oh, well, I'm good now. I spent about the last 15 minutes trying to get connected to YouTube.
Oh dear.
Other than that, how are you?
I'm fine. I have to say, with you having the problems getting connected, I was thinking, I understand that the weather in eastern New Mexico is not too good this morning, so I was hoping we don't have any problems.
Where are you? In Albuquerque or
No, I'm
Santa
here in
Fe?
Santa Fe.
Yeah,
Mr.
I'm looking
Leonard,
out my window. I'm in Santa Fe too. Yeah.
I just wanted to double check. It's my if I'm remembering correctly, you prefer to swear in the witnesses yourself, or did
Well,
you?
um, that's how I usually do it, but I would
That's
be glad for
fine.
you to take one more duty off of my back.
I'd be happy to do it.
So,
It's up to you, sir.
okay. All right, I anticipate only, let's see, looks like two witnesses. And I would, a lot of times I'll do them en masse at the beginning if there's going to be a bunch of witnesses. But with only two, we'll probably refer to them as they begin their
Exhaustion's
testimony. We
here.
can swear them in at that time, okay?
All right, that
Yeah,
sounds
yeah, got
good.
it. Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm looking out the window. It just started raining here downtown, by the way.
Yeah, it's the wind is howling outside. Good morning.
Hello, are you Sonny and Mr. Badell?
Yeah, I am Mr. Bedell, but I'm not the sunny one.
Oh, sure you are.
Yeah, she just stepped out. Sunny, our attorney, just stepped out, sir.
That table looks like I could land an airplane on it.
Yeah, almost.
Looks a lot like a,
I think it's a bit distorted because of the camera view, but this is the Rhodey Law Firm. I'm visiting Sunny's. Well, she's visiting also. This is their Albuquerque
If we
office.
lose connection.
That's what I thought. Looked a little different.
nice.
For the Hyatt building.
What's that?
Yeah, and you can see it's a bit cloudy out
Oh,
there too.
Hi, Anna. I see you're on.
All right. Okay, great. Oh, yes, I guess.
Anna, we are on YouTube as far as I can tell right now.
Thank you. I was just checking.
Yep. Okay, sweet.
Thank you. And I appreciate all your help. It took me, actually, this is actually the second time I got hooked up to YouTube. First time about 15 minutes ago, it just seemed to disappear. And I think it's because I'm using my home DSL line, which is not as high bandwidth as the state issued cell phone, but I couldn't connect on the state issued cell phone this morning. And I really don't know why. I tried a few different things with that as well. So I'm on my home DSL. That's an announcement for you guys too. If something happens and we drop off, I'm going to have to reconnect. I don't anticipate it, but as Miss Ash Hoyman and I have been just discussing, we've got rain falling outside and it is windy outside at this very moment. Hi, are you Miss Nixon? Yeah, I can turn on the sound if you'd like.
There you go.
Oh, thanks, John.
Hey, there you go.
This is our witness and CEO of Sacred Wind, and he is very savvy technologically. And I am not, so I have to warn you
Well,
in advance.
I would think he would be.
Yeah, one would think so.
And I would hope that he would be savvy. And
Yeah. Well, my knowledge is limited, and it's anything that was fabricated after 1950, I guess.
that's
Good
very
morning,
impressive.
Good morning, Miss Nixon. This is Allison, your court reporter. It's been a while. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Mr. Hearing Examiner,
There's another client checking in. I don't know if you can hear me, but it froze
I can hear
up
you.
with the words "want to," and I've got no more movement on my screen.
we can see you.
And hear you.
And you are moving on our screen. Okay.
Excellent.
I Guess you can hear us.
You came back to me.
Yes. Mr. Hearings Examiner, I want to mention too, if you haven't heard, the Navajo Nation president wanted to make an appearance today during the public comment portion of
Actually, I had not heard that. I checked on the e-docket to see if any public comment had been filed, and there had not been any, and I haven't been notified that anybody wanted to. If there's no objection, of course, it's not evidence, as you all know. If there's no objection, certainly he will be allowed to comment. If there is an objection, then I'll have to rule on the objection and hear what the objection might be. I really don't anticipate that. At this point, I better not comment further, although this is a purely procedural issue. It could turn into the merits, and I'm not allowed to speak to the merits without all the parties present. And I don't see counsel for staff checked in yet, so I'll wait to comment further. Would that be the same gentleman whose letter was attached to your testimony, Mr. Bedell?
No, sir, it isn't. This is the president of the Navajo Nation who was later notified after our filing by the executive director of the Navajo Nation Telecom Regulatory Commission about the proceeding, and the president at that time said he wanted to say a few words.
Okay. Well, I'm always it's always great to have the public participate, but as I explained, and as your counsel can explain to you, it's not evidence. Commentary is not evidence, and the case is determined solely on evidence, not on any commentary. But it would be an honor.
Thank you.
So it's 9:51. We've actually got 9 minutes. So we, yeah.
I'm going to run down the hall here.
Good time.
I heard someone comment that the Farmer's Almanac is predicting a very cold winter this year. And, so I guess buyer beware. I mean, I don't particularly enjoy winters. I do enjoy the snow, but I think we're going to get, according to what I hear, we're going to get a lot of cold with not as much snow. We'll see.
Wow, I'd rather it be the other way, not too cold, but a lot of snow. Does that mean you have to put the carbide tips on the trenching machines if it's cold?
Well, I don't know. Oftentimes we don't do much construction during the winter. If it's, especially if there's too much snow on the ground. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Forest Service even blocks off of their access roads when there's a lot of snow on the ground. So we plan for the bulk of our construction in the better months.
Okay, I might mention that we are being broadcast on YouTube. Mr. Ripperger, welcome. I see you, but I don't hear you. Let's check your mic and stuff.
Well, hopefully it's working well. Good morning, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Good morning. It sounds perfectly. I didn't see any movement on the screen. There you go. You're moving.
Yes,
Well, every once in a while, our bandwidth is not sufficient to sustain both video and audio. So if I see some notchy movement in my own, in particular, on my own video, I'll switch off the video in order to make sure the audio gets through. So it's something, Mr. Ripperger, if you notice that, you might want to switch off your video. Generally, I prefer video because I really like in-person hearings.
Sure.
And it feels a little more like an in-person hearing if we have video as well as audio. So I prefer that the video remain on. I prefer, since I'm talking and we have about 6 more minutes to consume, I prefer that the audio remain off unless you're speaking. And the reason for that is every once in a while, a dog will start barking, or a big diesel truck will ride past the window outside and cancel out the audio that I can hear. Miss Nicolau, is it? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Good morning, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Yes, Mrs. Nicolau.
Good morning. It's pleasant to hear you and to see you. So your audio is working perfectly. You didn't submit direct testimony, so you're not going to be testifying. Is that correct?
Correct, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Are you an observer for Sacred Wind?
Correct.
All righty. Thank you. Mr. Ripperger, have you talked to Mr. Bagato this morning?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, I have.
Okay, so he should be checking in within 5 minutes or so. And J.C. Bedell is Miss Bedell, is that correct?
Yes, it
There you
is.
are. Okay. Nice. You're in time. We have about 5 minutes to wait. Hi, nice smile. And your video and audio are both working, and that's good to know.
Yes.
If you didn't, I don't think you heard me, but I usually like to keep the video on if possible. A few reasons. One is I like it's a little closer to having a regular hearing. Secondly, every once in a while, believe it or not, someone will have their audio on, their audio off, and they'll be just talking away, and they think everybody can hear them. So I have to yell out, "You're muted." And if I can't see them, I don't know that they're muted. And after you do this for a while, looking at all these little boxes on the screen, you start to pick up cues like people moving around papers and things. And lawyers sometimes object to testimony, and they might raise their finger or something like that, and then I can acknowledge that they're there. So that's why I like the video, but I like the audio off in case a dog starts barking or a truck drives by or something like that. Here's a question for everyone there. Who is T. Charlie? Anybody know?
Yes,
Who is
Mr.
it,
Hearing
Miss
Examiner. This is Tico Charlie with Sacred Wind. He will also be observing unless you deem it less desirable to have so many observers from our company. But Tico Charlie is our Navajo liaison. He works with the various chapters of the Navajo Nation.
Okay. Hi, Mr. Bagatko, welcome on board. And Mr. Moffat, welcome on board. I've never seen you before. Nice to put a face behind the name.
It's nice to meet you as well. Thank you.
And to answer the question, which we haven't been talking about anything substantive, by the way. Mr. Bedell, normally, I'll give you a little procedure stuff. I'm actually neutral. I'm fine with observers, Miss Nicolau and Mr. Charlie. I even like observers. It's better to have more observers, perhaps. The only time I would be concerned about it is if one of the parties might object to there being observers, and then I would have to rule on it. So I don't take a position in most things, most such things. Your counsel has been there present with you, so you and I have been conversing more or less directly. But normally when there's counsel present, I don't communicate directly with witnesses either, which is kind of interesting, but your counsel hasn't mentioned anything, so I'm glad to talk with you. Mr. Bagatko, let's check your audio. You there?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Mr. Moffat, can we check your audio?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I don't know how you did that, but you managed. This is like that TV show that used to have the squares of people. Somehow you moved to a different square. um, Mr. or Miss Charlie, I have no idea. Mr. Charlie or Charlie? Could you turn on your video, please? Hey, how are you? I cannot hear you, but it doesn't show that you're muted, which is interesting. So maybe you might want to check your audio feed or your audio connection and see if you're connected audio. It's 9:59. We've got about one more minute before we're scheduled to go, according to my computer anyhow. Miss Nixon, do you know of any other persons who we might expect today? I cannot hear you, Miss Nixon.
If we're on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, John. So I do not think so. Mr. Badal tells me no. So.
Okay. Mr. Bagatko, Mr. Ripperger is here. He's your only witness. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're flying light. It's just me and Mr. Ripperger.
Okay, great. Mr. Moffett, I don't believe you filed direct testimony, so you shouldn't have a witness today. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Do you plan on, well, we're still seeking procedurally. We're not on the record yet, but we are on YouTube. We're being broadcast to anyone who takes the time to look in. Procedurally, do you intend to cross-examine the staff witness or the applicant's witness?
I don't anticipate that unless something happens that I'm not ready for or anticipating today.
Okay, thanks. Very good. Mr. Charlie, I see that you have a little microphone next to you, so I presume you have audio now. That's interesting. The mute sign went off, but I still didn't hear you. Well, just in case you need to say something, I believe you are going to make a public comment. Is that correct? Could you nod your head, please? No. Okay. Well, it'd still be nice to you to have audio if you need to. Mr. Badel, we're still waiting for a public commenter to log on. Is that correct? To join us?
That is correct, Your Honor. It's your decision, though, whether to continue now without them or not.
Well, it's only 10:01, and I usually can stall for a little time because I do public comment before any testimony is taken. And I'd certainly like to do that. Honestly, I don't think I have a prohibition on taking public comment later in the hearing. But, we're going to start testimony, and I really don't like to interrupt testimony either. Here's somebody that's named TRC. Let's see who that is. Whoever TRC is, could you put on your audio and your video? We would appreciate it.
Absolutely. This is Chris. Good morning. My apologies.
Chris who?
Christopher Vicente with the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission.
Can you spell your last name, please, sir?
Absolutely. It's going to be B for boy, ECENTI.
Wow, I should have recognized that name. That's one that I'm familiar with, but you speak kind of quickly, and every once in a while, and it's something we can talk about before we go on the record, every once in a while there's technical glitches with this Zoom thing, and I don't even know it, but I'm not hearing audio, and just little chunks of words disappear. And I think that actually just happened when you said your last name, because I got the enti, but I didn't get the buh. Vicente, and I didn't hear the whole thing. So it's 10:03, and I think we are ready to go. But you haven't missed anything either, Mr. Vicente, and you seem to have disappeared again. But we talked only about procedural stuff. I had a little trouble connecting this morning. I'm on a very weak DSL line, and if I should disappear for you guys, or if I should freeze up, first thing I'll do is turn off my video, and I certainly don't want to turn off both audio and video, because I think then I'm disconnected and I won't be able to see what's going on. If that should happen, I've actually never had to completely go down, but we might need to all reconnect. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. I'm ready to go back I'm ready to go on the record. Council, I'm going to ask you if there have any other procedural matters you would like to discuss, and any reason we should not go on the record right now. Let's start with Mr. Bagatko. Any reason?
No reasons, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Please go ahead and get her rolling.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting. I didn't hear the word no. I heard the word reasons, but I could tell by your tone of voice that you have no objection to going on the record. And Miss Nixon, oh, there you are. Any reason to not go on the record?
No reason. No reason.
And Mr. Moffat, any reason to not go on the record?
No reason.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. The only reason I can think of is like procedural questions about the Zoom hearing and things like that. We are being broadcast on YouTube, so there could be many members of the public viewing us. Miss Ash Hoyman, are you ready to go on the record?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's begin this hearing. We're now on the record. Good morning. My name is Robert J. Lennon. I am a hearing examiner for the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. We are here today on case number 21-00193UT. The caption of this case is, in the matter of the petition of Sacred Wind Communications, Inc. for support from the State Rural Universal Service Fund. And that's it. And that's why we're here. There was a, well, it's entitled petition. You can call it a petition or an application. A petition for relief. It actually has been pre-labeled as Sacred Wind number 2. We're going to create a record. We're going to create evidence, and a recommended decision will be created by me based on the evidence committed. I believe we're also going to hear some commentary this morning before we do the evidence, and that'll be from Mr. Chris Vicente, who is with us. His box says TRC. He should know, and I believe he knows that his comments are not evidence, and I'm only permitted, and of course I would only create a recommended decision based upon the evidence, not on commentary. Before we started, I looked at the e-docket system of the PRC to see if any written commentary had been filed and somehow not sent to me as it should have been. I didn't receive any written commentary. I didn't see any commentary filed. Mr. Bagatko, do you know of any written commentary being filed?
As we sit here right now, no, I do not, Mr. Hearing Examiner. But if I pick up on something, I'll bring it to your attention.
Ms. Nixon, you don't know of any written commentary filed, right?
No, Mr. Examiner, I have not received any.
Thanks. I asked because sometimes it doesn't make its way to me. Okay. Let's see. I think we're ready to hear commentary, and then we can move on to the main part of the hearing, which is the testimonial part. For the record, let's have council, before we do that, let's have council identify themselves. Ms. Nixon, please. Can't hear you, Ms. Nixon.
Off again.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vidal is running the controls here, and we're trying to mute so we don't get any feedback. But so if there's a delay, I think that's what's happening. So yes, Mr. Examiner, my name is Sunny Nixon, appearing with the Rhodey Law Firm, appearing for Sacred Wind Communications, Inc., the petitioner in this case.
Thank you, Ms. Nixon. Mr. Bogatko, please.
John Bagatko, appearing as counsel for the Telecommunications Bureau of the NMPRC, and I am accompanied by my sole witness today, Mr. Michael S. Ripper.
AKA staff, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Moffitt, please, who do you represent? Introduce yourself and who do you represent?
Good morning. It's Mike Moffitt on behalf of the New Mexico Exchange Carrier Group.
And the Exchange Carrier Group includes, of course, what we're going to probably be calling comparable carriers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe there are two that have been selected to be comparable carriers.
Well, okay. Thank you, Mr. Moffitt. Appreciate that. There are no other council present, correct? And there are no other parties, correct? Mr. Bogatko, is that correct?
That is my understanding, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Thank you. As you know, I asked because we're creating a record, and I certainly don't want to start this hearing missing anyone. Mr. Vicente, would you care to make a public comment? Normally we, first of all, does anybody have any objection to Mr. Vicente making public comment? Mr. Bogatko?
No objection from staff. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Mr. Moffitt?
No objection.
And Ms. Nixon?
Of course, no objection.
Thank you. I try not to presume anything, and I try to keep the record as clear as possible. Like I was about to say, normally we limit public comment to about 3 minutes. You're the only public commenter we have, so if you should care to go over 3 minutes, provided there's no objection from anybody, I would be glad to hear from you completely. So you need not restrict yourself to 3 minutes if there's a problem keeping within 3 minutes. Mr. Vicente, because we're making a record and it probably will turn into a written transcript, I'd ask you also to identify yourself and then make your comment. It's all yours, sir, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity. Of course, for the record, my name is Christopher Vicente, Executive Director for the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission. And I'm actually here in support with Sacred Wind on this particular matter. I just mention a couple different items that have been completed and done in the past with our leadership within the Navajo Nation. Back in February 16th this 2021, President Nez did submit a letter in support of the Senate bill that just passed earlier this year. So if it's okay, I'd like to go ahead and read the document into the record. Dear New Mexico legislatures, on behalf of the Navajo Nation, I would like to thank Sacred Winds for providing their equality and opportunity to the Navajo people by providing access to high quality telecommunication services at affordable rates since 2006. Telecommunication services, including high-speed internet, are beneficial for the Navajo people, enabling them to have equal access to healthcare services, emergency services, and education and economic information, as do people off the tribal lands. Prior to 2006, only 26% of Navajo families in Sacred Winds territory had access to telephone service and no broadband. In 2021, every home has telephone access and 90% of the family that Sacred Wind serves has access to some of the highest speeds on the highest speeds of internet found on tribal lands in New Mexico. My apologies. So with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission manages a state universal service fund that was created to support providers of telecommunication services in rural areas of the state. And Sacred Wind is the only rural telecommunications company in the state that does not receive the support from the Universal Service Fund on an ongoing basis. So please support Sacred Wind Communications. They respect our culture and have been very supportive of our communities they serve. Sincerely, signed by Jonathan Nez. And I also do have another document here from the Nahanazad chapter from Fruitland, New Mexico, another letter just in support for Sacred Wind to be able to have access to the universal service funds. On behalf of the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, one of the things in our code is to promote and expand. Therefore, any service providers that are providing any kind of telecommunication services to any of the families within Navajo Nation, we are right there in support. So with that, we humbly request any kind of support the New Mexico can provide in enabling the Sacred Wind to have the ability to have access to the universal service funds. Again, we appreciate this and thank you so much.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashhoyman. I think that was you. I heard everything Mr. Vicente said. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Vicente, and mention that you did a nice job. You're welcome to remain with us online if you choose. You're also welcome to just switch over to YouTube if you choose, or if you have something else you'd like to do, you're welcome to do that. There will not be a decision announced today. The recommended decision is in writing, and it's done later. I will mention to everyone, I've actually spent about 4 hours yesterday reviewing the testimony, so I'm quite familiar with the case at this point. I also recognize that there doesn't seem to be much of a dispute according to the testimony of the two witnesses. There does the rebuttal testimony and the supplemental testimony. So what I would like to hear at this point is a brief opening statement by first Ms. Nixon, and then by Mr. Bogatko, and then perhaps even more brief by Mr. Moffett as to the status of the case, the issues in the case, and what you intend to prove with your testimony, and if there is a conflict that you recognize, what you intend to disprove about the evidence presented by the other parties. Ms. Nixon, was I just clear, or do I need to clarify?
So, Mr. Hearing Examiner, I think that was clear, and
Okay.
I'm happy to provide an opening for Sacred Wind if you wish. And if you have any questions as I go through it, please interrupt me so that I can respond. I wasn't planning on doing an opening. In the many years that I've practiced before the commission, we usually don't do openings, but I'm happy to do one, a short one.
Well, I've been a lawyer like 36 years, but I've only been at the commission for about a year and a half. And I've done many openings statements, and I just like opening statements. Gives me a little roadblock for the rest of geez, that was maybe a Freudian slip. Gives me a little road map for the rest of the case, and it's helpful to me. So yeah, perhaps just a few sentences, if you would, Ms. Nixon, please.
Of course. As you know, having read the testimony and the petition in this case, Sacred Wind Communications, Inc., the petitioner, has applied for SRUSF support pursuant to a statute that was added to the Rural Telecommunications Act in 2021. And there are two provisions that are upfront in this case and will allow Sacred Wind to avail itself of the SRUSF fund. And the prominent one is subsection L that has been added in 2021 to section 62 or 63 9H 6. And it provides, just paraphrasing it, that the commission shall award an applicant ongoing fund support at no less than the average access line amount of funding support for comparable carriers. And then it contains a proviso that the carrier is not entitled to receive support for at levels lower than basic local exchange business and residential rates for such support by any of the comparable carriers. And comparable carriers, they are defined now, having been added in 2021, as an eligible to telecommunications carrier established prior to the enactment of the RTA that has similar number of access lines as eligible telecommunication carriers established after the enactment of the Act. And of course, Sacred Wind was established after the Telecommunications Act, and that's why it is availing itself now of this new statutory provision. And briefly stated in its petition and in its direct testimony of Mr. Vidal, Sacred Wind set forth 4 carriers that it believed were comparable carriers. And we asked in our petition for support per annum of $1.54 million, and also asked for the monthly amount of, I believe it was $449, based on these comparable carriers, both in line, number of lines, excuse me, sorry, wouldn't you know? Sorry about that, I forgot. So it asked for $449 per access line per annum, and made the case that it was entitled to this under the new statute as amended. And then staff filed its testimony, and staff came up with 2 comparable carriers. Only one.
2.
Pardon me?
Only 2, not the 4, and they were different, of course.
At least Tularosa Basin was not different. It was a common one for both Sacred Wind and staff. And staff correctly pointed out in its direct testimony that the proviso in the statute, and that because Sacred Wind's rates could not be lower than comparable carriers, it was limiting its proposal for comparable carriers to both Penasco Valley and Tularosa Basin. And the lines for both, the line access for both are less than Sacred Wind's, but their business and residential rates are lower than Sacred Wind's. So Sacred Wind's are at least the same as or higher than. So these 2 comparable carriers qualify as comparable carriers. And Sacred Wind has agreed and concurred with staff's analysis, their analysis of both the statute and their choice of comparable carriers, Penasco Valley and Tularosa Basin. And also agreed with staff's recommendation for the total annual support under the statute. And that being on pages 4, 15, and 19 of staff's direct, Mr. Ripper's direct testimony, that total amount being 1.33 million per year based on a set of 2 comparable carriers, those being the Penobscot Valley and Tularosa Basin. And for the monthly amount as set forth on page 19 of staff's direct, that being $386.91. The per line support amount for Sacred Wind. I'm sorry. So it would be that amount per annum. I'm sorry, not per month. That working out to be the approximately $1.33 million. So that's where the case stands. And Sacred Wind, as I say, has concurred with that recommendation and that statutory analysis and the 2 comparable carriers. In terms of anything that Sacred Wind would disapprove of, not at this juncture, it would disapprove, I would have to say, if that amount were reduced and if the comparable carriers were changed. And we note that in staff's direct and its supplement to direct filed on October 1, in both of those exhibits, MSR 1 and MSR 1 revised, staff does set forth alternatives to its primary recommendation, which I just summarized. And we would object if either of those were found to apply. And because we don't think they apply, we don't think the comparable carriers apply, the amount is less than what staff has recommended in its primary recommendation. We don't think that's supported by the comparable carriers that staff has referenced. And our view is that staff doesn't think they apply either. Staff put it forward for some reason, but we would object to anything less. So
Thank you, Ms. Nixon. That's even more than I hoped for, so I really appreciate that. The 1.33 million, actually you say that approximately 1.33. The actual number is $1,325,923.44. Is that correct?
let me check. I do think that's correct. I think that up front, Mr. Ripperger does on page 4 say approximately 1.33 million per year. And then later in his testimony, both on page 15 and page 19, he sets out the exact amount, which I'm just looking at it here. On page 19, he says 1,325,923,044. So
the only reason I ask is because when I say about, I usually round, and when I round, I usually round down or up. I don't automatically round up, and I want to make or down. And since we have a precise number, I would rather have used a precise number. And I'm wondering, I just want to make sure we all understand each other. Do you agree then that there really isn't much dispute in this case at this point, according to the testimony?
As I say, we would agree with that so long as staff's primary recommendation is followed and adopted by the recommended decision and in the final order of the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Nixon. I might have one more question. Let me see here. The distinction between the two original testimonies, direct testimonies, would really be as a result of interpretation of the word similar, SIMILAR, in the definition of comparable carriers, where it says comparable carrier means an eligible telecommunications carrier established prior to enactment of the Rural Telecommunications Act of New Mexico, that has, pause, a similar number of access lines. And then it continues. And the staff apparently thought it was important as to this, the similar number of access lines, and Sacred Wind perhaps was less inclined to dwell on the similar number of access lines. Am I understanding that correctly, Ms. Nixon?
Well, Mr. Examiner, my understanding of this is that Sacred Wind did analyze the similar number, and except for Tularosa Basin that it put forward, which is a common comparable carrier between Sacred Wind and staff, Sacred Wind's numbers were for Western and Navajo, set forth in John Vidal's exhibit number 4 to his direct, were higher than Sacred Wind's access line numbers as of 2020, which was Sacred Wind's number was 3,427 and is. And it did put forward Century Tel of the Southwest, which was somewhat lower. It's 3,080. So we were a little higher than staff, but on the other hand, staff's numbers for its comparable carriers, that being, and staff came up with slightly different numbers than Sacred Wind did for access lines. But staff's numbers for Tularosa Basin, I'm looking at Mr. Ripperger's MSR1, Tularosa Basin there was set forth as 3,043. So it's slightly lower than Sacred Winds, and Penasco Valley is even lower yet. That is 2,690. So both of staffs were lower than Sacred Winds. Sacred Winds were somewhat higher, but probably both fall within the range of similar number of access lines under the statutory definition. Of course, that's subject to interpretation, and that's what the witnesses did here. But I don't think either are out of the realm of support. I think the difference in the two parties simply was that staff picked up properly the proviso in the statute in subsection L2 that Sacred Winds rates could not be lower than the comparable carriers. And the truth is that Sacred Wind simply overlooked that proviso, and because most of its business concentrates on residential rates. But Sacred Wind did say in its direct testimony that it did not intend to charge rates that would be lower, business rates or residential rates. It was simply one of those things that was overlooked. And therefore, Sacred Wind is in concurrence with staff's interpretation of the statute and the proviso. Does that answer in a very long-winded way your question about similar access lines?
Yes, it certainly did. I'm looking at L2, a matter of fact, and it's a somewhat bifurcated. It probably could have been a 2A and a 2B, but it's just one paragraph. The second part refers to residential and business, and then it uses an S after the word level. Residential and business services at rate levels, two different levels. So I read that as a residential level and a business service level. Is that how your witness testified in his direct testimony?
Well, Mr. Vidal did testify as to residential rates, and we set forth in fact, we actually had an exhibit, and I believe it's number 3 and 4, that set forth the residential rates for the comparable carriers. I think it's actually 4, to be quite honest about it. Let me find it here. So that is the case. Let's see here. Residential rates. I know we had it. Okay, I'm sorry. It was 5. First page of John Vidal 5 to his direct testimony. Set forth the residential rates for the comparable carriers that it selected, proposed, and for Sacred Wind. And they are all $18 for residential rates, except for Western, which is slightly over at $18.25. As I said earlier, Sacred Wind simply inadvertently overlooked the business rate proviso in the statute, did not include it in its direct testimony, did not, I mean, it had the general statement that we didn't intend to charge lower rates, but in terms of a statute, in terms of a actual comparing express numbers, didn't include those in its direct testimony. So yes, I think that, you know, that statute, this proviso includes both basic local exchange, residential, and business service rates. I think we're in complete agreement on that. And
Okay,
staff
thank you.
pointed it out.
Thank you very much. That helped me very much. I want to make a comment that statements made by counsel is not evidence. And I know all the lawyers know this. Perhaps some of the observers with us today on the Zoom may or may not know that. And perhaps some of the people watching on YouTube may not know that. But everything that counsel just said is not evidence, and it's not considered. I can't rely upon it, especially if it would differ from what I find as evidence and what's presented as evidence. I certainly wouldn't consider it. So it's not evidence. Statements of counsel, opening statements or closing statements, are not evidence. I would expect counsel just to review what is evidence. And that, with that statement, we'll move on to Mr. Bogatko. Please, just a brief summary of what your evidence will present and what remains as an issue, if anything, please.
Well, very briefly, Mr. Hearing Examiner, and especially in view of the rebuttal testimony that was filed by Sacred Wind recently on October 4th, 2021, as far as staff is concerned, there are no disputes or evidentiary challenges to make because Sacred Wind agrees with staff's analysis under the new statutory provisions found in the Rural Telecommunications Act. And as you noted earlier, staff's recommendation based on its analysis came to $1,325,923.44. And with that per line support amount coming out to $386.91. And as counsel for Sacred Wind pointed out, that can be found on a number of places in Mr. Ripker's testimony, including on page 19, lines 1 through 15. And so with that, I would say that, you know, based on the testimony that's filed in the case, staff's position is that there is adequate evidence in the record to support staff's recommendations based on its analysis of a heretofore untested and novel statutory provision. This is a case of first impression under this particular section, which was trotted out by the legislature very recently. And between what staff has done in its analysis and what Sacred Wind brought to the table, I believe that we have a proper and valid recommendation for the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Bogatko. Well said. Mr. Moffett, a brief opening, please.
Yes, Mr. Hearing Examiner, the New Mexico Exchange Carrier Group does not have any issues with the testimony that's been submitted, but we're comprised of 11 members, some of which have been mentioned here already, and some of which are being compared with, and I'm here to protect those interests and make sure that the representations are accurate for my clients. But I at this point, don't see any issues.
Thank you, sir. And I just want to verify for the record, you, on behalf of your client, have not submitted any direct testimony. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all very much for the brief openings. Now we'll get to the meat of the case, which is the admission of the evidence. We have Mr. Bedell's direct testimony. We have Sacred Wind's petition, which is offered as, which is marked at this point as number 2. We have their rebuttal testimony, which is marked as number 3. We'll try to get those in through Mr. Bedell relatively quickly. Actually, this meat of the hearing could be shorter than the opening statements, which is not normal, but that's just fine. And then we'll move on to Mr. Bogatko, who will present the direct testimony of Mr. Ripperger, September 20th, the supplement to the direct testimony. And as far as I know, that's all of the evidence. Is there anything else, Ms. Nixon, that will be presented today?
Examiner, I don't anticipate it at this point, but of course, we have to see how it unfolds. Given the opening statements, I would not think so.
Thank you. Mr. Bogatko, did I miss anything?
I don't believe so, Mr. Hearing Examiner. It looks like we have a full slate of pre-filed testimony to move into evidence in this case.
Wonderful. Okay, let's do it. Miss Nixon, I keep trying to call you Roddy because the name Roddy is right underneath of you on my screen.
I'll answer to that.
Okay. Miss Nixon, could you please identify your witness? And Miss Ashhoyman, if you would swear him in, I would appreciate it. Miss Nixon, who's your witness?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, Sacred Wind calls John W. Bedell as its only witness in this case. And he is the Chief Executive Officer of Sacred Wind Communications, Inc.
Okay, we can have him testify to that too. Miss Hoyman, please swear him in.
Sir, do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Miss Nixon.
Mr. Bedell, would you, despite that introduction, would you please state your full name and your business address for the record?
Yes, my name is John W. Bedell, as B-A-D-A-L. I am the founder and CEO of Sacred Wind Communications. Our business address is 5901 J Wyoming Boulevard Northeast, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 87109.
Thank you. And did you file direct testimony in this case on behalf of Sacred Wind Communications, Inc.?
Yes, I did.
And from time to time, I think I will refer to it as Sacred Wind, just for shorthand. Sure. And I will represent to you and on the record that I circulated prior to the hearing, because this is a virtual hearing on Zoom, on the Zoom platform. As required by the hearing examiner, I circulated to the hearing examiner, to the court reporter, and to staff, and to the attorney for the New Mexico Exchange Carrier Group, your direct testimony marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit 1, the petition by Sacred Wind marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit 2, and your rebuttal testimony as marked as Exhibit 3. And I'm going to hand you a copy of each of those pre-marked, pre-labeled exhibits so that you can refer to them if you wish. I'm sure you have your own copy, and go ahead and refer to those too, but I'm just representing that I'm handing the witness these pre-marked exhibits that have been circulated. So we're looking at first what has been marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit number 1. Is that the direct testimony that you filed on behalf of Sacred Wind? And is it dated July 29, 2021?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And Do you have today, as you sit here and having reviewed it, do you have any changes or corrections to that testimony?
Now, other than those mentioned in our opening statement, I have no corrections or changes to it.
Okay, and as it was filed on July 29, recognizing that staff had not filed its testimony or that you had filed your rebuttal testimony.
That's correct.
And if you were asked the same questions today as contained in that direct testimony, marked Exhibit 1, Sacred Wind Exhibit 1, as of July 29, 2021, would your answers be the same as set forth in the testimony?
Yes, they would.
And is your direct testimony as of that date true and correct?
Yes, it is.
And with that, I move the admission of Sacred Wind Exhibit number 1.
I have just a couple questions. I note that it's the caption page says July 29th. I note that the e-docket indicates that it was received by the commission on the 29th. But I looked at the verification and it indicates that it was verified the day before on the 28th. I don't think it's any issue or any problem. I just wanted to note that for the record. I don't know if you want to examine your witness any further because the verification date isn't the same as the date on the front, but I'll mention that. I have another question from Mr. Bedell. The exhibit includes the 10 pages, I think. Let's see, 10 pages. It also includes the verification. It includes the exhibit number 1, which is a letter from Mr. Johnson, number 2, which is a letter from Mr. Simpson. And then exhibit number 3, which has already been exhibit number 3 and exhibit number 4, exhibit number 5, which is multi-paged. It also includes a letter from Mr. Templeton of April 30th, and also includes document entitled NMEG ECG members basic local exchange rates, July 1, 2020. And then it concludes with a certificate of service. It does, I want to make sure what I'm holding in my hand and what I've reviewed and what I will continue to review is the same thing you're holding in your hand. Is it, sir?
Yes, it is, sir.
Thank you. And Ms. Nixon, if you have any follow-up, because I asked that question about the different date on the verification, you're welcome to ask him, redirect anything.
Okay, sure. Mr. Examiner, I think that you identified that letter from Mr. Templeman, signed by Mr. Templeman, as July 1, 2020. And the date that is on the first page is, I believe, April 30, 2020. At least that's what I heard. Perhaps I heard it incorrectly. But just as a matter of clarification.
Well, it speaks for itself. Let me get it in front of me. It's dated April 30, 2020. It's part of exhibit number 5. Am I correct there, counsel?
That's correct. Right. That is correct. It does include a date, July 1, 2020, but the date of the letter is April 30.
You know, sometimes my mouth says what my eyes see rather than what I'm actually thinking. So thank you for that clarification.
Understand.
And we are okay.
It's all of us. So, Mr. Bedall, turning, if you would, on what's been marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit number 1, which is your direct testimony.
Yes.
Turning to the verification that's attached to it, which follows page 10. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
And do you see that your verification was acknowledged on July 28, 2021?
I'm looking for that. Let's see. On the 28th of, yes, of July 2021.
And because of logistics, where your office is located in Albuquerque versus where my office is located in Santa Fe, did you review what has been dated as your testimony of July 29, 2021 in making this verification about the correctness of your testimony?
Yes, I've reviewed my testimony on or before the 28th of July. Yeah.
And it's the same testimony, even though it contains the date of July
Yes.
29? Is that
Yes,
correct?
that is correct.
And of course, today you have verified it as your testimony.
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Nixon. Are there any questions from Mr. Bogato on behalf of staff?
No questions, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moffett.
No questions. Thank you.
Ms. Nixon, do you move for admission?
Yes, I did move for admission of Sacred Wind Exhibit Number 1.
Pardon me, I must have missed that. Any objection, Mr. Bogato or Mr. Moffett?
No objection, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
No objection.
Thank you. There being no objection, Sacred Wind number 1 is thereby admitted into evidence. Please proceed with number 2.
Thank you. Mr. Badal, turning to what has been pre-marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit Number 2, which is, let's see if I can find it here, which is titled The Petition of Sacred Wind Communications, Inc. for support from the State Rural Universal Service Fund and request for expedited consideration by the Commission. And referring to that, did Sacred Wind file this petition with the Commission on July 29, 2021?
Yes, we did.
And in your direct testimony, did you adopt this petition?
Yes, I did.
And at the end of this petition, turning to right after the signature block and before the certificate of service, did you verify this petition?
Yes, I did.
And as of July 29, can you verify, sitting here today, that this petition is true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
It is.
With that, I would move the admission of Sacred Winds Exhibit Number 2, the petition.
Thank you. I have no questions for the witness, and perhaps Ms. Nixon could comment. There's in the bottom, in the footer of each page, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 long numbers. Is that some sort of internal code at the law firm that I should disregard?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, that's exactly what it is. We put those numbers on our documents so that we can locate them in our computer system. They're called DMS numbers, document management system numbers, I believe. So yes, that's what they are.
I presumed that, and I didn't think that was an appropriate question for the witness, but I kept seeing them, and this is a public hearing, and the e-docket is for the public, and perhaps some member of the public might want to review the document, the exhibit on the e-docket, and I thought we should at least clarify that. I didn't think your witness would, well, I didn't know, maybe he would know, but I thought it might be a question for counsel. It's not exactly evidence, but it clarifies it for me. I don't have any, I of course read this as the initial pleading in the case. Now, unless there's any objection from Mr. Bogatko or Mr. Moffett, or if they have any examination of the witness, I'm going to admit it. So any questions or objection to it being admitted, Mr. Bogatko?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, no objection to its admission and no questions for the witness, Mr. Badal. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Moffett, same questions.
No questions and no objection to the admission.
Thank you. I heard the move to admit. So there being no objection, Sacred Wind number 2 is now evidence. It's admitted. Thank you. Please proceed to number 3.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Badal, if you would turn to what has been marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit number 3. Is that a copy of your rebuttal testimony dated on the cover sheet, October 4, 2021?
Yes, it is.
And do you have here, sitting here today, any corrections or changes to your rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
And if you were asked the same questions today as contained in that rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, it would.
And to your knowledge, to the best of your knowledge, is your rebuttal testimony filed on October 4, 2021 true and correct?
Yes, it is.
And with that, I'd move the admission of Sacred Wind Exhibit number 3 for the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Badal.
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Moffett, just to be different. Any cross or any objection?
No cross-examination and no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bagatko, same.
That's the same, Mr. Hearing Examiner. No questions for Mr. Badal and no objection to admission of what they've marked as Sacred Wind Exhibit number 3. Thank you.
There being no objection, foundation being laid, Southwest number 3 is thereby admitted. Is there any other evidence you plan to present, Ms. Nixon?
No, Mr. Examiner, we do not. And of course, we do reserve our right to do redirect if necessary, based on any questions, either yours or other counsel to the case.
Thank you, Ms.
So
Nixon. Understood completely. I didn't ask the question to lock you in. I just asked so that we could move the case along and move over to staff's presentation. Thank you very much. Mr. Bagatko, you already identified yourself as staff's lawyer. I understand you have some evidence to present. Please, well, we need to swear in your witness. Why don't you identify your witness, then we'll have your witness sworn in, and then we'll move to the evidence.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, with that, staff would call its sole witness today for this proceeding, Michael S. Ripperger, to the stand.
Good morning, Ripperger. Mr. Ripperger, if you could be sworn in by Ms. Hoyman, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bagatko, please.
Mr. Ripperger, you are the Telecom Bureau Chief for the NMPRC, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
If I remember correctly, I think you filed some direct testimony in this case on September 20th, 2021. Does that jive with your recollection?
Yes, it does.
And I'll warrant to you that I've pre-marked your direct testimony as Staff Exhibit 1, and I circulated it to all the parties in the case, including you, Mr. Ripperger. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have a copy of what's been provisionally marked as Staff Exhibit 1 in front of you?
Yes.
Would you take a moment to flip through that, Mr. Ripperger, to make sure that this rendition of your direct testimony filed on September 20th, 2021 is complete and accurate copy of your testimony?
It appears to be. Thank you.
Mr. Ripperger, I take it you don't have any corrections to make to the direct testimony as we sit here today at this proceeding. Is that right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Ripperger, well, let me make sure here. Obviously, this testimony was prepared by you at your direction, correct?
Yes.
And that would include the exhibits and attachments to this direct testimony as well, right?
Yes.
All right. With that, if you were asked the same questions today at this proceeding as what we see posed in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers to those questions be any different?
No, they would not. We'll get into it, but I did file supplemental testimony clarifying a few things at that time.
That's correct.
That are in the direct. Right.
Excuse me. Thank you. All right. Well, then with that, Mr. Hearing Examiner, I would move for the admission into evidence of Mr. Ripperger's direct testimony that's been marked as Staff Exhibit 1.
Thank you, Mr. Bogatka. Mr. Ripperger, I have a couple questions. Just to make sure what I have is what you have. There's a cover sheet, which is page 1, not labeled page 1. There's testimony of about 19 pages. Then there's your exhibit number 1, which is your comparison chart. Then there's actually 12 pages, which is a federal public notice. Then there's your Appendix A of cases you've previously testified. And then there is a December 20th affirmation of your testimony. Is that what you have?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, that is what I am looking at here.
Okay, so that's.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, for
Yes, sir.
clarification, it's September 20th.
September 20th.
Okay, thank you.
That's the affirmation, correct?
Correct.
Alrighty. Okay. Let me ask, let me see if I have any questions. I'll just ask very simply, why did you choose Telerosa Basin and Penasco as the comps, the comparatives?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, as my exhibit MSR 1 sort of shows, my interpretation of the statute was that there needed to be, Sacred Wind was to be given a per line support based upon the similar support of, or the support of carriers with similar numbers of access lines. And so based upon that, I took the access line counts of all of the carriers who receive ARS support and then looked at those who had the most similar number of access lines for comparison. In looking at 639H6L2 and the language saying that the comparable carrier had to have, well, let me get the language. Is it similar as a comparable number of access lines? But also to use the language here, the commission shall award an applicant ongoing for no less than the average access line of funding for comparable carriers. We have to go back to the definition of comparable carrier, has a similar number of access lines, but with the proviso in L2 that pursuant to this subsection that the carrier who is to receive support shall not offer basic residential and business services at rates lower than the rates of such services charged by any of the comparable carriers used for the determination of the level of support. So it seems to me as if what it's saying is that if Sacred Wind's business and residential rates are if they are lower, then you really probably shouldn't be using them in the analysis. I mean, that's a bit of an interpretation, but that's the way that we read it, or I read it. And so based upon that, when you do a sort of the carriers and a similar number of access lines, you preclude those with higher rates. And when I did that and looked at those with the most similar number of access lines, it was Tularosa Basin and Penasco Valley, which seemed to be closest given that proviso about rates. So,
And you used a percent difference rather than an absolute number difference. Is that correct?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, I did simply because it was easier to see. I mean, you can get a number when you put it into percentages. It gives it's just another way of looking at it. Similar number of access lines. It was just easier, I thought, for me to visualize it, and maybe for other parties in the case to also visualize the difference in the number of access lines.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. I got that from your written testimony, but I wanted to hear it from you. It helps me a bit. So thank you very much for that testimony. So let's go around and see if there's any other examination. Miss Nixon, do you have an examination of this witness?
Has this been admitted? I didn't realize it had been.
Not yet. Do you have any objection to admission of the document?
I have no objection.
Mr. Moffat, any objection?
No objection.
Thank you. There being no objection, staff's number 1 is now admitted. So now I'll ask you, Ms. Nixon, since I asked him a few questions, if you'd like to, on behalf of your client, ask any clarifying questions, please do so.
I have one clarifying question, actually, and I wondered if he would turn to page 13, the line and footnote 26 on that page, and would ask Mr. Ripperger if the number in the parenthetical there, which I believe refers to Sacred Wind's access line number, is 3470, or if it is 3427. Just wondered if that was a typographical error, or if that's actually the number that he intended.
I'm sorry, I did not notice that discrepancy in the number of access lines. I do believe it is 3427, and that includes 3427. I'd have to go back and look at the annual report, but it should be, let me get my exhibit here. 3427. So I did know that there were 4 official lines in the annual report, and all the rest of the lines were business and residential lines. So that would make it 3423, I believe, business and residential lines, and 4 official lines. And thank you for noticing that discrepancy in the lines. I believe that 3427 is the correct number.
And I thought you would say that, but I just wanted to determine if that was a typo or something else. So I appreciate that clarification.
And I appreciate you finding that. I did not notice that.
So let's go. Just a moment, Mr. Examiner, if I may.
Sure.
Mr. Examiner, Sacred Wind has no further questions of Mr. Ripperger at this point. I mean, depending on what you ask him. I mean, we might have some follow-up depending on what you ask him, but at this point, no.
I have no further questions. Mr. Bogatko, no further questions, is that correct?
Just, one minor question.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Bogatko, on behalf of staff.
Right. Mr. Ripperger, I'm sure you recollect the conversation you just had with counsel for Sacred Wind, correct?
Yes.
And specifically with regard to footnote 26 on page 13 of your direct testimony that's been marked as Staff Exhibit 1, you acknowledged a correction to that number, 3470 to, what was it, 3423?
Yes, it would be 3423, subject to check.
And we thank counsel for that correction. But here's my question then. The correction to footnote 26 on page 13 of your direct testimony does not change the outcome of your analyses and the ultimate recommendations you reached in this proceeding, does it?
No, it does not. And the reason being is because if you look at exhibit MSR1, it was 3427 that I used in the analysis. And I believe that matches the number that Sacred Wind proffered in its testimony.
All right, that's all I've got. Thank you, Mr. Ripperger. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. I turn it over back to you.
And thank you for the question, Mr. Bogatko. That's helpful. Mr. Moffat, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that number one came in.
Mr.
Do you want to move
Examiner,
on to-
Mr.
Yeah.
Examiner, if I may I
Sure.
have just a moment? before we
Absolutely, you
proceed?
can have a
Thank you.
moment. And I'm going to check my email because looks like something has come in. Okay, doesn't look like anything for this case, so I can ignore it again.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Examiner.
Any questions?
No questions.
Thank you. Mr. Bogatko, it's the same witness, but if you want to move on to your next staff exhibit, well, I already labeled it number 2, but it's the supplement to the direct testimony. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Go right ahead. Let's put it in.
Thank you. Mr. Ripperger, you do recall filing something entitled Supplement to Direct Testimony of Michael S. Ripperger on October 1st, 2021 in this case. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And as with Staff Exhibit 1, I pre-marked this as Staff Exhibit 2 and circulated it to all the folks in this case, including yourself. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
And I trust and hope that you have a copy of what's been provisionally marked as Staff Exhibit 2 in front of you.
Yes, I do.
And if you'll take a moment, Mr. Ripperger, just to flip through that, can you confirm whether or not this is a complete and accurate rendition of what was filed in this case as supplement to direct testimony of Michael S. Ripperger?
It does appear to be that. Thank you.
Mr. Ripperger, do you have any corrections to make to your supplement to direct testimony as we sit here today?
No, I do not.
And I trust that this supplement to direct testimony, inclusive of its exhibits, were prepared by you or at your direction. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And now, Mr. Ripperger, if you were asked the same questions today at this public hearing as what we see posed in your supplement to direct testimony, would your answers to those questions be the same as what we see in Staff Exhibit 2?
Yes, it would.
And if the hearing examiner will permit me, and you had alluded to this earlier in our conversation, Mr. Ripperger, can you just briefly tell us what the purpose was behind the filing of supplement to direct testimony of Michael S. Ripperger, Staff Exhibit 2?
Yes, thank you. I was aware in my initial testimony that there was some potential discrepancy in actual line counts for the access reduction support carriers for December 2020. I had received access line counts from the administrator. There was some discrepancy with some of the numbers, maybe with Sacred Wind. I was looking at the annual reports. I thought maybe I was close, but I also knew that on September 27th, all the carriers by order of the commission would be filing verified access line counts for December, end of year, December 2020. And those would be the final and accurate access line counts for the carriers. I felt it was important for the commission to have accurate access line counts for its determination in this case. I also believed it was appropriate for staff to look at any changes in access line counts and its recommendation and analysis. The recommendation remained the same. However, there was a slight change in analysis based upon access line counts, but I do believe that these are the accurate access line counts for those carriers at this time. And believe that the revised exhibit MSR1 is the latest, most accurate staff analysis and recommendation.
Thank you for that, Mr. Ripperger. And with that, Mr. Hearing Examiner, I would move for the admission into the evidence of this case, the supplement to direct testimony, Michael S. Ripperger, filed on October 1st, 2021, and provisionally marked as Staff Exhibit 2.
Thank you. Before I hear from opposing counsel, I just have a question. I want to make sure I'm not missing something, Mr. Ripperger. The line count numbers for Sacred Wind didn't change from your MSR1 to your MSR1 revised, right? It's still 3427, right? Could you turn your audio back on, please?
I apologize. Mr. Herring-Zimmer, that is correct.
And then I'm looking at Penasco, and it looks like it's still 2690, so that one hasn't changed either, right?
Mr. Hearing-Examiner, no, it did not change.
So the only significant one that changed was Tularosa Basin, which you had previously reported as 3043 line count, and in the revised you reported as 2694. Is that the substance of the corrected revised MSR1?
Yes.
And even though there's a different number for Tularosa, it's your testimony that the same figures apply, the 1,325,923 and 44 cents, and the monthly 386.91. Is that correct?
Mr. Hearing-Examiner, yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I was clear about it. Thank you for answering the question. Since I've asked questions, Mr. Bogatko, do you have any redirect?
No redirect necessary at this time. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Thank you. Mr. Moffat, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
And any questions, Ms. Nixon?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, just a brief one. Your line of questioning, I think perhaps covers this. When you asked about the line access numbers for Sacred Wind didn't change, I understood Mr. Ripperger to say that is correct, that they are still at 3,427. I believe I heard him say something about a discrepancy for Sacred Wind. Is that correct, Mr. Ripperger? Could you say something to that effect?
The only discrepancy was the error in the number in the footnote in the prior testimony. I believe that 3427 is the number of access lines, because when I looked at what Sacred Wind put in its testimony, and I looked at the annual report, I believe that's the same.
Okay. And I think I heard you say it in reference to what had been submitted by the Exchange Carrier Group on September 27. And I just wanted to make sure that there was nothing in there. There was a discrepancy as to Sacred Wind, correct?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have no further questions. Mr. Moffat, any questions?
I have no questions.
And Mr. Bogatko, no further questions of this witness?
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Thank you, sir. Do you have any additional evidence to present through this witness, Mr. Bogatko?
No, sir. And I take it then that Staff Exhibit 2 gets to come into the record?
Oh, pardon me. Thank you for keeping me on track. Let me go through one more time. Is there any objection to admission of Staff Exhibit number 2, Ms. Nixon?
No objection.
And Mr. Moffat, any objection?
No objection.
There being no objection, then Staff Exhibit number 2 is admitted into evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. And thank you to everybody else. And with that, staff would rest.
Thank you, staff. Glad to hear that. Is there, Mr. Moffat, you didn't present any direct testimony, so there was no witness. I don't think you're permitted really to present evidence at this point, but I'm going to ask you anyhow. Did you intend to present any evidence today?
No, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Thank you, sir. I believe that closes the hearing. Ms. Nixon closes the testimony anyhow. Ms. Nixon, do you have any additional witnesses or evidence you'd like to present?
No, Mr. Examiner. We don't.
Thank you. And Mr. Bogatko's already rested on behalf of staff, so I won't ask him that question. I believe the testimony part of this hearing is completed. As I said, I like lawyers' closings, and Ms. Nixon, if you choose, you're welcome to present a very brief closing. It could be briefer than your opening, so I'll leave that up to you. Would you like to comment on what you've proven?
Well, yes, Mr. Examiner, it will be much briefer than what my opening was. I believe where this case stands is that both Sacred Wind and staff concur on staff's primary recommendation in this case, that, and to just refer to Mr. Ripperger's supplemental direct on page, I don't know why I'm having so much trouble talking. Just because it's dry, I guess. I believe he says on page 3 of his supplement direct that the primary recommendation has not changed, and based on all the testimony. And of course, that was before the rebuttal came in. But as it stands now, my understanding is that both parties agree to the estimated annual reimbursement of $1,325,923.44 as the award for recommended award for Sacred Wind, and under this case as petitioned, and that the comparable carriers, as he states, both parties agree, would be Tularosa Basin Telephone Company and Penasco Valley Telephone Cooperative. So I think that's where this case stands. The parties are in agreement on the primary recommendation of staff.
Thank you, Ms. Nixon. Mr. Bogatko, closing.
I'll keep it as brief as possible, Mr. Hearing Examiner. I think it's suffice-it to say that application of this new provision found in the Rural Telecommunications Act under 63-9H-6L to the facts as staff was able to determine them in this case, support staff's recommendation that counsel for Sacred Wind just went over. Essentially, that staff still recommends that Sacred Wind be awarded a per access line count reimbursement of $386.91 per access line based on the average per line support of comparable carriers, Tularosa Basin Telephone Company and Penasco Valley Telephone Cooperative. And this would still amount to an annual reimbursement of $1,325,923.44. And I believe that it's adequately supported by the evidence that's been admitted into the record, and is consistent with intent and spirit reflected in that new provision found in the rule.
Excuse me, Mr. Bogatko?
Yes.
Your voice faded out. It has been admitted into the record, and it's consistent with the intent
and spirit of this new statutory provision found in the Rural Telecommunications Act of New Mexico. With that, Mr. Hearing Examiner, I would close my closing statement. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Bogatko. Mr. Moffitt, your counsel, and you're welcome to make a closing.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. I have no need for a closing.
Thank you. As far as I can see, this hearing is ready to be closed. Ms. Nixon, do you have anything else before we close the hearing, adjourn the hearing?
No, Your Honor, we don't. I must call you Your Honor at least once.
It's okay. I don't mind too much. Mr. Bogatko, anything further before we adjourn the hearing?
Nothing further, Mr. Hearing Examiner, other than to thank you and to thank the parties to this case and the people who were willing to comment in this proceeding. And that's all I've got.
Thank you. Mr. Moffitt, is there anything else?
Nothing else from me. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Thank you. And I can't think of anything else we need to go over. So That being said, it's approximately 11:23 a.m. Ms. Hoyman, we can, the hearing is adjourned. We can go off the record. And now we're off the record. Thank you all for appearing. The observers, Ms. Nicolau, Miss Bedell, and Mr. Charlie, and Mr. Vicente, who was kind enough to comment for us. I thank you all for attending. Anybody who's watching on YouTube, I thank you for watching. I don't have anything else I need to say. If no one else has anything to say.
One more thing.
Yes, sir, Mr. Bagatko.
I forgot to thank our court reporter, and I apologize if I started talking a little quickly. I try to meter my tone and the rate at which I jabber on. So, but thank you very much for being here today to do this for us. And that's really, this time, I promise, all I've got.
I did not put that on the record. I hope that's okay. I had closed it out, but I thank you.
It's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bagatko. Of course, I concur. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to turn off the Zoom meeting. Bye-bye. Till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.